Hello and welcome to the Starting Thousand Suns series, the series where we go from your first purchase to your first 2,000 point army list and everything in between for the chaos forces of the Thousand Suns. In this video we're going to be taking a look at the great cults for the Thousand Suns, which function as the sub-factions for the Thousand Suns, as all codexes have their set of sub-factions. And as the Thousand Suns are a Psyker-focused army, unlike other sub-factions which offer a trait, relic, and stratagem, the Thousand Suns sub-factions offer a trait, relic, and psychic power. And all the Psykers that belong to a great cult know this psychic power, so you're not limited in that sense, and you have a lot more mileage from that psychic power that the great cult offers, making the Thousand Suns gain quite a good amount of advantage from the great cults in comparison to many other armies that are reliant on a potentially more restrictive stratagem. Though do remember that each psychic power can only be manifested once per battle round unless otherwise specified. More so because of the variance of the different psychic powers within the great cults. There are two great cults that dominate the tournament scene, and a few that could potentially break out. So we'll begin by looking at those two great cults first, and then we'll look at a few great cults that have some potential of breaking out in the future, as their abilities aren't bad. And finally we'll conclude with the great cults that are the most bizarre and probably the least likely to see play, due to their benefits being either too niche or a little too weak in comparison to some of the other great cult options. The first great cult we'll look at is the Cult of Duplicity, and the Cult of Duplicity is by far the most popular tournament cult. So what makes this cult so powerful? To begin with, let's take a look at what their psychic power does, as that is the ability that is going to be most ubiquitous throughout your forces. The psychic power they gain is called the Sorcerer's Facade, and this is a blessing psychic power that has a rather high warp charge value of 8, which isn't too extreme but can still be a little bit difficult to make in some situations. This psychic power, once manifested, allows the Psyker to select one Cult of Duplicity infantry or monster unit within 6 inches of the Psyker and remove that unit from the table, and then redeploy it anywhere on the table more than 9 inches away from an enemy. Abilities like this one in other armies, such as the Solar Flare for the Admech or the Veil of Darkness for the Necrons, are incredibly powerful abilities, and this is no exception in that regard. Though do keep in mind the psychic power does not teleport the caster, which makes it a little bit harder to move the unit with a supporting buff character or caster, but it can be used each turn, and some units within the Thousand Suns are very powerful regardless of having a support unit with them, as they can stand on their own while sitting on an objective or positioning to encounter an enemy. And don't forget that 9th edition is an incredibly objective-focused game, so being able to outposition and outmaneuver your opponent in a terrain-filled board is an incredibly powerful ability to have, especially when you can use it as you can use the psychic power, which does really show the issue of putting such abilities within a specific sub-faction, as it really does force players into that sub-faction to some extent. One other thing I would like to mention about the psychic power is that it also combines rather interestingly with the teleport strike ability that allows the Terminators to deep strike. Although there are more restrictions on the teleport strike ability, so there are situations where you'll just use this instead of that. However, you can use the psychic power to set up a unit on the field so that it can screen and provide a future position for when you're ready to teleport strike down the Terminators into that position as well. Then when the Terminators do come down, they'll bolster that position and support that unit further. This is a very fun and interesting combination of abilities that gives you an amount of mobility and positioning that many other armies wish they could have. Now moving to the Warlord trait for the Cult of Duplicity, this trait is incredibly powerful as well. It is known as the Master Misinformant, and what it does is it says that at the start of the first battle round of the game, before either player takes a turn, you can select up to D3 non-vehicle Cult of Duplicity units and redeploy them along with the bearer of this trait. And this is very powerful as, once again, after you and your opponent deployed, you can reposition some critical units to either protect them better against your opponent's potential first turn, or to better take advantage of your first turn. And abilities such as this have been very powerful in the past with certain armies such as the Ultramarine Forces. However, this does have the vehicle limitation, and usually abilities like this are best with larger and more bulky units. However, the Thousand Suns do make very heavy use of infantry units, so this is perfectly fine for the utilization with units such as that. Now, not every part of the cult is going to be a home run, and the relic is unfortunately a little weak for the Cult of Duplicity. The relic for this cult is the Perfidious Tome, and what the Perfidious Tome does is that each turn in your command phase, you may use this relic, and if you do, you roll a d6. On a 4+, you gain 1 command point, but inversely, if you roll a 1, your opponent gains that command point instead. This means you have a 50% chance of gaining a command point yourself, and roughly a 17% chance of giving your opponent a single command point. Really, the swinginess of this relic is not particularly great, and there are going to be much better relics for you to choose from. Not to mention that even though this will average out through the course of many games, you're going to run into that single game every now and then when you pretty much gain no command points and you give your opponent several command points. That's never a fun situation to be in, and frankly the payoff isn't particularly great enough in comparison to the detriment that you can experience, as well as the cost of eating up one of your relic slots with this relic. I wish this was a more interesting relic, but then again, considering the power of the psychic power and the warlord trait, you do have to accept that the relic is going to be a little weaker, otherwise this specific cult would be so incredibly powerful that other cults would not be able to compete. And with the cult of Duplicity covered, we come to the second cult that is seeing a good amount of tournament play, and the only cult that really rivals the cult of Duplicity in terms of popularity. This cult being the cult of time. So what does the cult of time bring to the table? Well, the first thing we're going to look at, like always, is going to be the psychic power, as it's going to be the most impactful throughout the game, as the most amount of units in your army list are going to benefit from this part of the cult. The psychic power for the cult of time is known as the Time Flux, and this is a blessing psychic power with a warp charge value of 6. And what this power does is it allows you to select a friendly cult of time infantry unit within 6 inches of the caster and revive a destroyed model in that unit. This doesn't seem like much, but then you have to realize how durable the scalable cult terminators can be, and how powerful resurrecting one of those terminators can be, especially if you can do it every single turn. I may have even underestimated the Legion command that allows it to heal up a model within a unit, simply because I did not consider just the incredible durability of the scalable cult terminators in comparison to many other units within the game. And not only that, but the scalable cult terminators are a powerhouse unit within themselves and see ubiquitous play within the Thousand Suns, so this definitely has a lot of application in that sense. Now moving on from the psychic power, we come to the trait of the Cult of Time. The trait is called Immaterial Echo, and what this says is that if the bearer manifests power with a psychic test of 9+, in your psychic phase, they can attempt to manifest one additional power within that psychic phase, and if that power is successfully manifested, it cannot be denied this turn. That seems like a rather powerful ability, as all of a sudden you can use a psychic power and then manifest another psychic power that is impossible for your opponent to deny. Though do keep in mind not every army can deny psychic powers, and some armies may struggle to deny your psychic powers to begin with. Not only that, but do remember you have Kabbalistic rituals that can help you resolve your psychic powers without your opponent being able to really deny them. And on top of all of that, without any modifiers, if I did my math correctly, you have about a 30% chance of rolling a 9+ on 2 dice. But with that being said, don't forget, this is the Thousand Suns. You have a lot of ways of modifying that psychic test, such as the Kabbalistic rituals previously mentioned. All in all, I think this trait is actually a rather interesting one, though it is one that's a little bit questionable in terms of how powerful it actually is, due to the fact that it's not always going to be relevant, and in other situations, it might not have any impact on the game at all. All in all, I think it's something that's more of a throw-in than something you want to focus on when building your army. Finally, we have the third and final benefit of the Cult of Time being the Relic. The Relic is once again a little bit of a niche item, being the Hourglass of Manat. And what the Hourglass does is it says the first time that the bearer is destroyed, they are revived at the end of the phase at least 1 inch away from any enemy models with D3 wounds remaining. This can actually be a sort of interesting item, especially on something like a Thousand Suns Demon Prince, and can be very interesting and fun to play around with. However, do remember that this ability can very easily backfire if it happens to occur on your turn, and then goes to your opponent's turn where they just finish off that model on their turn anyway, and in that situation this relic did almost nothing. Though even then at least you've absorbed some damage, and it's still a bit of a fun relic, so there are going to be some situations where you can make great use of the Hourglass as well. With the two cults that are the most popular and the ones that are seeing all of the tournament play, we come to the cults that are probably fringe playable, though maybe a little on the weaker side, so they do have to overcome a little more struggle to be successful than the two most popular cults. And I'll also say before I begin looking at these additional cults, whereas with the first two I had tournament results to look at and essentially determine which ones are the most popular, with these ones I kind of have to use my best judgment, so do keep in mind this list may vary depending on playstyle and other people's opinions, as there's essentially no hard data for these additional cults. Though with that being said, even though I don't necessarily rate a cult particularly highly, does not mean that it's bad or unplayable. It's simply my opinion, and it's not something that should stop you from trying out one of these cults if you think it has some interesting benefits that your personal army can utilize and you can have fun with. So with that being said, let's look at the third cult on this list. This cult being the Cult of Scheming. The Cult of Scheming psychic power is called Seated Strategy. What the psychic power is it's a blessing that has a warp charge of 7, and it says you can select a friendly Cult of Scheming core unit within 24 inches of the caster, and until end of turn, the unit can shoot and charge in the same turn that it fell back in. This is actually one of those very powerful abilities that can actually be incredibly useful within many different game states, especially with some of the units that the Thousand Suns has, as they have things like the Scarab Occult Terminators, but those are already such a powerful unit that the psychic power can end up being a bit more of a win more ability. Though with that being said, imagine a turn in which a group of Scarab Occult Terminators or Rubric Marines can fall back, shoot their special weapons, and then charge in to clean up the enemy. That sounds very powerful, and once it starts going, it's something that you can really use to overpower your opponents. And it's one of those psychic powers that I think is a little bit underrated, and I think can actually go quite a long way within the course of a game. Now the trait for the Cult of Scheming is called the Grand Schemer, and it's actually an aura ability. This trait is an aura that grants Cult of Scheming units within 3 inches of the bearer the objective secured ability, and models that already have objective secured count as double for purposes of calculating who has control of the objective. This is once again a very powerful ability, as 9th edition is a very objective focused game, and abilities like this can really swing the course of a game, as all of a sudden you can gain control of an objective that you otherwise would have lost and would not have gained the points for in your primary objective. Though that being said, the range is rather limited for this, and many armies gain something like this for free on different support models, such as the Sisters of Battle with their Dogmata model. The Dogmata pretty much sees play in almost every single Sisters of Battle army, so it does show the power of an ability like this, though with that being said, the Dogmata also comes with quite a slew of different abilities. Now moving on to the relic for the Cult of Scheming, I'm probably going to mispronounce this relic name, but the relic is called Chakathal's Theorem. And what this relic does is it says once per battle, if the bearer is on the battlefield, this relic can be used to reduce the command point cost of 1000 Suns Stratagem to 0 command points. This is kind of an interesting relic and a bit of a marginal ability. Though consider the following: if you take this relic with the stratagem known as Sorcerer's Arcana for 1 command point, you'll almost always break even when you utilize this relic unless something happens to wipe out the bearer or the bearer does not happen to be on the table. However, in other situations, you'll find that you'll be able to apply this to a stratagem with a higher command point cost than 1. That meaning as long as you have room for this relic, when building an army list, you'll always pretty much break even, and in several cases, you'll essentially be gaining command points when using this relic. As such, this is a nice little marginal gain that can be very interesting and very useful throughout the course of a game. It's definitely something you should always include if you have the room to include it, but many times you might find it difficult to find the space to include that additional relic, so it'll probably be one that gets left on the sidelines, as it's just a marginal benefit and one that won't necessarily swing the game in your favor. The fourth cult, in my opinion, is the Cult of Change. And the Cult of Change psychic power is called Demanifestation, and this is a malediction psychic power with a warp charge value of 6 that lets you select an enemy within 18 inches of the caster, and until the start of your next psychic phase, subtract 1 from that unit's leadership and attack characteristics. This does require a little bit more setup, and isn't the best ability against shooting armies, but against certain melee armies and mid-range armies that might be okay with utilizing melee, this can really screw up some of their math, as taking 1 attack away from every model within that unit does hamper some of their ability to really put out the damage necessary to take out some of your units. However, what really hampers this psychic power is that it's only going to be useful in so many situations, so there is going to be some difficulty getting the most value you can out of this, and in other situations, your opponent's unit might be able to put out so many attacks regardless of this psychic power that it's not going to matter in that situation either, even if you reduce their attack characteristic by 1. Now, as for the trait for the Cult of Change, it's called Fickle Nature, and what it says is the bearer can reroll charge rolls, as well as the bearer can shoot and charge in the same turn that the bearer falls back. As we mentioned with the Cult of Scheming, the ability to fall back and shoot and charge is a very powerful ability, and even being restricted to a single model as opposed to a unit, this ability is still very strong. Not only that, but the ability to reroll the charge roll is also incredibly powerful. Because remember the following: a melee character that happens to fail his charge roll has already missed every single attack it would have made, and many times is left out in the open for your opponent to shoot down before it will ever be relevant within melee. So this warlord trait is incredibly strong on something like a melee-oriented demon prince or other character that wants to get into combat and stay within combat. As for the relic for the Cult of Change, this relic is called the Capricious Crest. and this relic says that once per round, when a psychic test is taken within 18 inches of the bearer, after all rerolls are made, you can change a 1 to a 6 if the psyker is a friendly unit, or you can change a 6 to a 1 if it is an enemy model. This seems like a very powerful ability at first glance until you realize it only impacts a roll of a 1 or a 6, and it can only be used once per round, meaning that you can either use it on a friendly model or an enemy model, and not once in each of them during the course of an entire battle round. And that's a rather limited ability, as not only are you limited to once per battle round, but it has to be a 1 or a 6 specifically, and not any other die roll. In addition to that, whichever caster is rolling that dice has to be within 18 inches of the bearer of this relic. Sometimes it's going to be very powerful, but in the majority of games, it's probably going to be a little too situational, and in some games, it's only ever going to affect your units and not your opponent's units, so this is definitely a weaker relic when you consider all the different restrictions that it has to overcome. Now the fifth cult and the final cult that I think has a comparable power level to the previously mentioned cults is the Cult of Magic. And the Cult of Magic has a psychic power known as Astral Blast. The Astral Blast psychic power is a Witchfire power with a warp value of 6. The Astral Blast says that the closest enemy to the caster that is visible and within 12 inches of the caster suffers D3 mortal wounds, and each other unit within 3 inches of that unit suffers 1 mortal wound. This is kind of like a bit of a weaker smite, as it can't proc additional damage if your roll is high enough, and it has a little bit of a shorter range. Though with that being said, it does do that additional splash damage of 1 mortal wound, so at least they have that going for them. Now let's move on to the Cult of Magic Warlord trait. The trait for the Cult of Magic is known as Devastating Sorcery, and Devastating Sorcery says once per psychic phase, when the bearer of this trait manifests a smite or Witchfire power, the bearer can reroll the psychic test. This is fine enough for consistency, but the Thousand Sons have so many ways of making their psychic powers more consistent, so that this seems a little bit unnecessary and is probably a little on the weaker side. That being said, there might be situations where it's nice to have that additional consistency on a psychic power you use early on, because the reroll in itself is not going to be that incredibly consistent. That way you can use this reroll on that early smite, and then use Kabbalistic Rituals and other abilities to smooth out additional smites throughout the turn, thus giving you a very smooth and easy to access turn. Now moving on to the relic for the Cult of Magic is known as Arcane Focus. The Arcane Focus relic says that the bearer can select one friendly Cult of Magic Psyker within 6 inches of the bearer, and that Psyker gets a 1 point Cabal point reduction when using Kabbalistic Rituals. This is a nice enough relic to smooth out the cost of some Kabbalistic Rituals, but the short range makes it very awkward to use, and there are generally going to be better ways of finding Cabal Ritual points within an army list than utilizing this relic. All in all, I don't think the Cult of Magic is going to be one that sees any particular high level of play, as it itself is already significantly weaker than the 4 previously mentioned cults. The problem with the Cult of Magic is that everything it does is a little bit underpowered, and pretty much something that you can pretty much access within the Thousand Sons army through different means. Compare the Psychic Power, which is probably a slightly underpowered smite ability, to something like the ability to teleport units, reduce the attack characteristic, or to revive fallen units, and you quickly have to ask yourself, does your Thousand Sun army need a pseudo smite ability in comparison to any of those other psychic powers? In addition to that, the consistency offered by both the trait and the relic is marginal at best, and can be gained through other means within the Thousand Sons army. All in all, I think this shows kind of some of the issues with some of the sub-factions, that while they don't do anything particularly wrong, they don't do anything particularly exciting enough in comparison to some of the stronger sub-factions that definitely overshadow them within the codex itself, making it feel like in many codexes, there are about 3 to 4 primary sub-factions, and everything else is kind of an afterthought that might be a cute throw-in. And now, especially with the restrictions on mixing sub-factions within match play, you're even less likely to utilize some of these smaller sub-factions within an army list. And now that we've covered the top 5 cults, let's take a look at the bottom 4 cults for the Thousand Sun forces. As I mentioned previously, these bottom 4 cults are probably a little too weird to be playable, though there might be some situations where you can find a place to make these work. As we've seen in the past, many sub-factions and even armies of renown that were assumed to be unplayable ended up doing rather well in events as people found ways to adapt them to the meta. So with that being said, let's take a look at our 6th cult for the Thousand Sons. The 6th great cult is the Cult of Knowledge, and the Cult of Knowledge has a psychic power known as Empiric Trespass. Empiric Trespass is a malediction psychic power with a warp charge value of 6, That allows you to select one enemy within 24 inches of the caster, and each time an attack is made against that unit by a friendly Cult of Knowledge model, a wound roll of 1 can be rolled for that attack. This can add up rather quickly, but most armies have easier ways of gaining access to this kind of ability, and it's a bit of a marginal ability compared to some of the other powers available to the different cults, so already the Cult of Knowledge is starting off with a bit of a weak power. Let's take a look at the trait for the Cult of Knowledge, which is the Ardent Scholar. And the Ardent Scholar says, when the bear makes a psychic test, they can reroll a dice roll of 1. Once again, a marginal benefit that only activates for one model and only activates in the situation that one of the dice rolls is a 1. That is kind of rough, and it's going to be significantly harder to gain consistent benefit from this ability in comparison to the psychic power, considering how many rolls you'll be making with this one specific model in the different psychic tests. As for the relic, we come to something that's not particularly exciting, being Enkaladian's Call. An Enkaladian's Call is simply a pistol weapon, so already we know it's not going to be particularly impressive, and it replaces a warp fire pistol with a profile of 12 inches, pistol d6 shots, 6 strength, 3 armor penetration, and 1 damage. Even though it's a pistol, it functions more like a hand flamer, and it automatically hits when making attacks, which is always a nice benefit to have. In comparison to the warp flame pistol, it only gains an additional 3 strength, which is nothing to laugh at, and 1 additional armor penetration. All in all, a decent upgrade to a pistol, but once again, are you really going to eat up your relic slot for a slightly better weapon? In this case, I might actually consider it just because of the massive strength increase on a reasonably decent enough flamer, though really being forced into the Cult of Knowledge just to gain access to this pistol, and giving up a different relic for this pistol does not really excite me, and does not really encourage me to really go down this route. This cult is not the worst one, and you can gain some marginal benefits by running it. I don't think it's really one that's going to give you enough benefit to really let you build something unique and interesting, so maybe this should have been lower down on the list, simply because it doesn't do anything particularly weird enough to really inspire something really creative, and it doesn't do anything particularly strong enough to really get you to a point where your army can be doing something unique simply because you stack different benefits. So all in all, I would say the weakness of this cult is that everything it does is marginal, and everything's just a little bit too weak without having some exciting abilities that are weird on paper, but might actually do something to catch your opponent off guard. Moving on to the 7th cult, we come to the Cult of Manipulation. The Cult of Manipulation has a psychic power known as Attempted Possession. So already with a name like that, you know you've already failed because it was attempted and not successful. Anyway, what does this psychic power do? Well, Attempted Possession is a malediction psychic power with a warp charge value of 5. And when you use the psychic power, you can select an enemy unit within 18 inches of the caster, and the unit suffers 1 mortal wound. And in addition to that, until the start of your next psychic phase, each time a psychic test is taken for the afflicted unit, they subtract 2 from their psychic test. This is kind of an all-around weak ability, as something like Smite will give you more mortal wounds in general, and there are other psychic powers that allow you to generate more mortal wounds than this psychic power. Though the ability to reduce psychic tests is nice and all to have, the problem is certain armies don't care about psychic tests at all, and in other situations your opponent will roll well enough that it doesn't really matter that you've reduced their psychic test. Imagine utilizing the psychic power only to hit an opponent that's just going to use Smite and successfully make their psychic test without any issue and absolutely not care about the second half of this ability. Inversely, imagine targeting something like Adeptus Mechanicus or Tau Empires which do not use psychic powers at all, and all of a sudden you find yourself having an ability that generates a single mortal wound. At least the psychic power isn't completely useless against psychic armies like some anti-psyker stratagems can be. Anyway, moving on to a trait for the Cult of Manipulation. The Cult of Manipulation's trait is Beguiling Influence, and Beguiling Influence says that attacks against the bearer cannot reroll the hit, wound, and damage roll. And this is fine enough in itself, as some armies heavily rely on rerolls, though in other cases some armies don't rely on rerolls at all, so this will be pretty much useless. Once again, the problem is that the benefit is marginal enough, and it doesn't really do anything against certain armies, which is a real shame. Now finally, the relic for the Cult of Manipulation is the Sororitas Mirror. The Sororitas Mirror says, when the bearer would fight, you can select an enemy infantry model with a leadership value of 9 or less that is within engagement range, and that model fights instead of the bearer. This definitely could be a bit of a fun ability to use, though do keep in mind that you're going to be getting a bit of a weak model in most situations, and in many situations, if you're just in a swarm of random infantry units, it's not really going to do that much if you're not possessing a character that's particularly good within melee. So once again, just another ability that's a bit too situational and really doesn't do enough to be particularly exciting. I don't think any of the benefits of the Cult of Manipulation are particularly terrible, I just think a lot of them are kind of underwhelming and a little bit too situational to matter, so really, it's just kind of an underpowered cult that isn't particularly exciting to play with in comparison to some of the other cults. The 8th cult down the list is the Cult of Prophecy. The Cult of Prophecy's psychic power is Divine the Future. This is a blessing psychic power that has a warp charge value of 6, and when you manifest this power, you roll a d6 and set it aside. You can then use this roll to substitute for a hit, wound, advance, charge, psychic test, deny the witch test, or a morale test roll for a Cult of Prophecy unit from your army until your next psychic phase. This psychic power is reminiscent of the miracle dice used by the Sisters of Battle. However, unlike the Sisters of Battle, it is only one dice, and it only lasts for one psychic phase instead of the entire battle. So all in all, it's a nice little ability to have. There'll be a little bit of fun, though generally if you roll poorly, that dice roll isn't going to be very useful, and it's not like you can get a good amount of them in order to substitute for different rolls as the game goes on. So for the most part, you're going to struggle a little bit to find applications for the psychic power to be consistently beneficial. That's not to say it can't be consistently beneficial, it's just that a single dice is not going to be as game-changing, especially when you consider that it expires at the beginning of your next psychic phase, making it a very small window of opportunity, which really does hurt this psychic power. If these dice lasted indefinitely, it definitely would have been a much more interesting greater cult for the Thousand Sons forces. Now moving on to the Warlord trait for the Cult of Prophecy. The Warlord trait is called Guided by the Whispers, and this Warlord trait says, when the bearer is selected as a charge target after firing Overwatch, but before the charge roll is made, it can move a normal move of up to 6 inches. This is a very interesting ability, and abilities like this tend to be rather strong. However, their best application is for screening units in order to deny enemy charges. So in this situation, you're going to have a much harder time screening for other units using a single model. Although that being said, there can be interesting applications for this and different ways you can mess with your opponent, so it's definitely a fun little trait to have, and one that can get you some decent advantage if your opponent misplays, as you can definitely deny charges very easily, and being able to deny charges for a melee unit is incredibly devastating, as a melee unit that fails to make its charge essentially misses every single one of its attacks, meaning that's essentially missed an entire round of gameplay and will probably be wiped out by enemy shooting. And with the trait being covered, we can move on to the relic for the Cult of Prophecy. The relic is the Ocular Brazier, and it says in your command phase you can select a Cult of Prophecy core or character unit within 6 inches of the bearer of this relic, and until your next command phase, each time that unit shoots or fights, it can reroll 1 hit roll, 1 wound roll, and 1 damage roll when making attacks. This is definitely okay, but it's a very marginal benefit, and it's one that many armies gain as a sub-faction-wide ability, as opposed to targeting a single unit, so really the benefit you're going to be getting is going to be quite small from this relic, though it's definitely one that can be okay, especially if you can kind of chain it across different units, so that you can utilize the shooting aspect of it in the first couple of turns, and then in later turns utilize the shooting and melee aspect of it as well. All in all, thinking about it now, I do think the Cult of Prophecy is probably better than the previously 2 mentioned cults within the bottom 4, as it does do some interesting things, and you can do some interesting tricks that can kind of catch an opponent off guard in comparison to the very marginal benefits that the previous 2 cults offer. As such, I should probably rate this cult a little bit higher, but with that being said, I do think all of the benefits are small enough that it's probably not going to be a particularly exciting cult, and there's going to be a lot of situations where the setup is going to be a little too difficult for something like the Psychic Power and the Warlord trait to really be taken advantage of. So for all the times you're going to have fun with those abilities, you're going to have situations where they're pretty much useless and don't really justify going into this greater cult. And the 9th and final cult is the Cult of Mutation. The Cult of Mutation has a rather bizarre psychic power, which is called Warp Reality. Warp Reality is a malediction psychic power, which has a warp charge value of 6. What it says is you select a terrain feature within 24 inches of the caster and visible to the caster. Then you select one enemy unit within 3 inches of that feature, and until your next psychic phase, that unit halves its movement speed and subtracts 1 from its advance and charge rolls. This is kind of an awkward and complicated ability, as you have to select a terrain feature and then select a unit within a very short range of that terrain feature. The benefit is rather good, and the range of this ability is not the worst in the world. Though with that being said, there are going to be situations where it doesn't really matter, and if your opponent knows how to play around it, they're definitely going to be able to deny your ability to really use this, as they'll be able to stay more than 3 inches away from a terrain feature with units that they want to have a high mobility on. Though in that situation, it's definitely going to make it a lot harder for them to use screening terrain as effectively as they otherwise would be able to. So this definitely has some benefits, but I think a good opponent will be able to play around this a lot more than you expect, and there are going to be situations where you really want to use this on a specific unit, but you're simply unable to for various reasons. I think it's a cool ability, and one that's kind of very strange, and maybe one that I kind of rated a little lower than I should have, considering how powerful it could be in certain situations. In 9th edition, the usage of terrain is very prominent, so there are going to be situations where your opponent can't easily and effectively avoid this, so it definitely has value in that sense as well. Now moving on to the Warlord trait for the Cult of Mutation, the Warlord trait is called the Touch of Vicissitude. The Touch of Vicissitude is a melee-focused ability that says melee attacks by the bearer inflict an additional mortal wound on an unmodified hit roll of 6. That's not a bad ability, though I do think it's a little bit too weak, as you're generally going to be generating 1 mortal wound when making attacks with any of your characters, considering that the Thousand Sons aren't particularly a melee-focused army. I wish they would look at some of these abilities sometimes and give them a little bit of a wider range, making it maybe on an unmodified 5 or 6, considering the army that it's played within. Though that being said, it could be interesting on something like a Thousand Sons Demon Prince. However, I think there are just better ways of achieving something like this, using the copious amount of smites you have, and not really worrying too much about generating a couple additional mortal wounds off of melee combat with a single character. Now as for the relic for the Cult of Mutation, it is another melee-focused relic, which is called Exalted Mutations. And Exalted Mutations adds 1 to the bearer's strength, toughness, and attack characteristics. This would have been an incredibly cool relic for a Demon Prince. Too bad this relic has a restriction that says it can only be used with Sorcerer models. This means you're limited with only 2 options, being a Sorcerer in Terminator armor and a regular Sorcerer. This does bring up a regular Sorcerer to a strength of 5, a toughness of 5, and 5 attacks, which isn't bad. If you happen to be a Terminator, you gain 1 additional attack for a total of 6 attacks. And if you're really looking to make a melee-focused Sorcerer, you can gain a little extra from using the Battle Psyker Legion command as well. That being said, it's all just kind of okay, and once again, I don't think this is a relic that really needed a restriction, as this cult is not particularly exciting and has a lot of limitations on how it's going to play out during the course of a normal game. That being said, I do think it's kind of an interesting cult, and I think it's probably one that has the most interesting and exciting psychic power, so once again, maybe I should have rated it a little higher. With that being said, the cults are definitely all very interesting, though part of me wishes they made less sub-factions and focus more on making the sub-factions that they do have more exciting, as it would give more playability to them. Either that or making the sub-factions overall weaker, so you don't have something like the Cult of Duplicity, which has an incredibly powerful psychic power, dominating most of the games, with only one other cult really being able to keep up with it. As it stands now, like in many cases, because a couple of sub-factions have very key and vital abilities, it ends up kind of forcing you within those sub-factions. Though the nice thing is you can switch easily between the sub-factions without really affecting your models, so you can have a lot of fun in that sense. Though like I said, I would have preferred maybe weaker sub-factions with such critical abilities being more generic to the army, so you don't feel as forced into one sub-faction or another, as it really does limit your gameplay in that sense. In any case, which is your favorite Grey Cult for the Thousand Sons army? Let me know in the comments down below. Anyways, as always, thank you for watching, and as always, I want to give a big shout out to my patrons. You guys are really awesome people and really do help support the channel. In addition to that, I would like to say, if you know anyone who may benefit from this content, please do share this video with them, as it not only helps the channel, but it also helps them out as well. And if you've enjoyed the content, do subscribe and like for future videos from this channel. Thank you for watching and have a great day. Bye.